Christ Community Church, located at 25th and Thomas Avenue in Portsmouth, Ohio.
It's a beautiful day here, and it should even be comfortable because we actually have 2 air conditioner units working for a change. And so that's a step in the right direction. If you knew what it costs, you'd probably leave, but it's really expensive to work on these cockeyed things, and we got 2 more to go. But we're making headway. Whoever, and they'll know exactly who I'm talking about, whoever is driving a black tank, you left your lights on. I don't need to name names and point fingers, but I'm just telling you that. And it's not David. Somebody else. Okay. Anyway, the message today is a little difficult because Jesus was talking to a crowd of people in the temple, gathered in the temple, and they knew all of the background of what he was talking about. I would venture to say that 9 out of 10 of you do not know the background. So I think it's important, if you don't have a bulletin, I put the information there. You need to just take the time, go back and get one, or lift your hand and they can bring you one. But you really are going to need it if this is going to make sense to you, because the background, everybody understood it, and so Jesus didn't refer to it, but he was talking about it. Now, what we're discussing, and the topic that we have here is judgment. Judgment that's going to take place in the immediate future, and judgment that's going to take place out there sometime in the future. Here's what you need to know that I put there. God is predictable for those who know him and know his will and to know his works. The way he's done things in the past, he'll do again, and he makes it clear. And so it's important to know what he did in the past and why he did it that way, so that we will know as believers what's going to take place. We won't know when, but we'll know what's going to take place, why it's going to take place, and actually we can be prepared. So the thrust of the message is to try to make this clear. So, and you need to know my concern. My concern about why this is really important is because, as we'll see in a little bit here, judgment off in the future will begin in the house of God. He begins with the people that know and are disobedient. That's where the hammer falls hardest. And in the last 50 years, the church has allowed Satan to divert us from our stated mission in order to try to turn the church into a social agency rather than God's will for introducing people to Jesus Christ. And I bought into it. It was Ralph who sat down with us, and we have, on an occasion, we have a kind of come to Jesus meeting among ourselves here on the staff, and we critically evaluate everything that we're doing to see how this fits into what Jesus said was the mission of the kingdom of God. We have fed here at church literally thousands of people. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But it has nothing to do, really, with the stated mission of God. We have, with the best of intention, and Ralph told us, he said, look, because he was the one who insisted that he be the person that when people come looking for spiritual advice or how to become a Christian, so on and so forth, he wanted to sit at that table. So he reported back and said, here's the problem. We've fed lots of people, we've paid their rent, we've fixed their cars, and few, if any, have ever come to Jesus as a result of it. So we have to reevaluate once in a while, and back through the years, we quit having hymn of invitations. And the result is what? You don't see near as many people coming to Christ. And so we have to reevaluate ourselves periodically. It's easy to point out there without looking at yourselves and discussing it and so on and so forth. Now, what we've done, I don't apologize for, because I think in most instances the intent was to be a blessing to people and to help people. But what happened was we diverted all of our energy away from the primary assignment. The primary assignment was to go into all the world and preach the gospel, to baptize believers and then teach them what God's will is, so that the next generation would be there to continue what He set up on Pentecost. The problem with that is that's whenever we divert our attention from something other than God's stated command. So look at this at the outset. God's stated command to Israel is exactly the same command He's given the church. The stated command to Israel was what? I want you to live in such a way that the Gentiles, that's a kind word for pagan, that the pagans can see what you're doing and know who God really is. Well, what happened was, instead of them being a light to the Gentiles influenced them more than they influenced the Gentiles. And in one instance there in the book of Romans, he said, so God gave them up to a reprobate mind and said, let's go to plan B. And plan B was the church. Now, Jesus said that the mission of the church was exactly the same as that which He had given. Now, once you're saved, your mission is to live in such a manner that the lost world can see who God is and what His will is by the way we live and treat each other. And we haven't done a very good job at that. And Satan has successfully at times diverted our attention to lesser things. Not that they were bad, but it wasn't what God told us to do. And in many instances, it looks better than what He told us to do as far as the general public is concerned. Let's look quickly now at your outline at the history of how God has executed judgment in the Old Testament. If we had a map up here of Israel, of ancient Israel, you would have Israel under Saul, King Saul, David, and Solomon. And when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam took over, and the elders had said, look, Rehoboam, your father has taxed people really heavily, has built all kinds of fancy cities, has built a temple that's covered with gold, and the people have been heavily taxed. Give him a break. And he said, are you kidding? If you think my old man was a tough hombre, you watch what I'm going to do. The result was that the northern kingdom sent to Egypt and brought a fellow by the name of Jeroboam up to be the new king of the northern kingdom. The capital city was Samaria. The southern kingdom, Judea, stayed under the son of Solomon, who was Rehoboam. Now, what happened then in the northern kingdom, eventually, in spite of just really dynamic preachers like Elijah and Elisha, in spite of their influence, the northern kingdom allowed Jezebel, who married Ahab, to bring all of the priests down from Tyre and Sidon, the priests of Baal, and the northern kingdom chose to be Baal worshipers, which allowed all of the lust of the flesh just to go rapid. And so God then sent, or allowed with his permission, the king of Assyria to come in, surround it, conquer it, and carry the people off into captivity. Now, this is another principle that will reflect itself in the New Testament. Whenever one of those nations, as Assyria did when it conquered Samaria, it took the citizens of influence all out of there and put them in another country, and then they brought people from another country in to replace the ones that they took out, because the people that they brought in didn't speak the same language, and the people who were there who was transported to another country couldn't speak their language, and so it became impossible for them to create a rebellion. It was a political act. So the people in Samaria, you remember, the northern kingdom, capital city of Samaria, I've been there several times, seen the ruins and so on and so forth up on a hill. All of the cities are on a hill. Were actually hated by the Jews of Jesus' day because they weren't of Israeli descent. They were foreigners. They were kind of like you all used to be about Kentuckians till we took over. Now, the result of that was, of course, that in Jesus' day, if you wanted to say somebody really something bad about somebody, you called them a Samaritan. That's why Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan who stopped and helped somebody when the religious people of Israel walked by the guy in trouble and they were going to church. Jesus was pointing out by using an example they fully understood. Now, Samaria fell in about 721-22 BC. The southern kingdom under Rehoboam actually fell under the same type of thing. They lost their interest in the will of God. They were more interested in doing what comes naturally. And the result was that God permitted another king, one that you all are more familiar with. It happened in about 586, 587, when Nebuchadnezzar came in and conquered the southern kingdom, surrounded Jerusalem, leveled the walls of Jerusalem, just like when Assyria came into Samaria, there's nothing left except a few little things here that can be identified. They just leveled the place. Same thing that Nebuchadnezzar did when he conquered Jerusalem. The temple was absolutely leveled. Later on, Cyrus conquered Babylon, and he allowed some of the Jews that had been taken from Jerusalem to Babylon to return under a fellow by the name of Zerubbabel. And he came back there, and then later on you have Ezra and Nehemiah who comes back with the specific responsibility and the permission of the Babylonians to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. So now we have the walls of Jerusalem up. And then later on, King Herod kind of rebuilds the temple for about the third time, rebuilt the walls, rebuilt a whole lot of other stuff. Now, let's understand something about interpreting the Bible, because there's a lot of confusion about what part of the Bible do you obey and what part do you don't. For instance, this becomes important for no other reason than tattoos. Believe it or not. Because today, about half of you all either have a tattoo on your behind where nobody can see it or somewhere else, because you want to have a tattoo. I volunteered to get one on my rear end, and my wife trumped it. No political intent there. It's just the way it works. She's the only one who has to look at it, and she ain't going to do it. That's the way that works. Yeah, that's what I said too. Yeah, and so, because the Old Testament says in clear English, you can't have tattoos. And if we're still living under the Old Testament, we need to get out the scrub brush and, have you all to strip down and get rid of them. But that ain't going to happen. Now, so look at the New Testament, and there's a fancy word for how you properly interpret the Bible. Now, first of all, you admit that the whole Bible is the Word of God. Excuse me. No, we don't argue about that. But is there any part of the Bible that's different from another part? Actually, we call those separations of times dispensations. And Jesus said that Old Testament dispensation came unto John the Baptist. He said the law and the prophets were unto John. Which meant then that all the traditions and the Old Testament law that aren't repeated somewhere else are now primarily as a resource to help understand the New. So in Luke, 16:16, somebody get me a snort. He said the law and the gospel were unto John the Baptist. What did John the Baptist do? John the Baptist introduced Jesus. He looked at him and said, what? This is my cousin. Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. So he introduced Jesus, and now we have a transition time between the Old Testament and the beginning of the church, which started on the day of Pentecost, recorded in the book of Acts, opening chapters, especially the first two chapters of the book of Acts. So we have the Old Testament dispensation, and we have a dispensation here that my teachers referred to in Bible college as the ministry of Christ. It overlapped a little of the Old Testament, and it kind of ceased and was handed off to us when the church age began. So you have the Old Testament era, you have the, thanks Bill, you have a dispensation that we'll refer to as the ministry of Christ that overlapped some of the Old Testament time and was in effect, because Jesus would say, now you have read or you have heard, but I say unto you. You have heard, but I say unto you. Now he could do that because he was the source of the Old Testament. And in most of those cases, what he was really saying is these traditions, not just the Old Testament thing, but these traditions that you've added to the Old Testament, we're going to get rid of. And he would say things such, was the Sabbath made for man or man made for the Sabbath? These various things that Jesus dealt with during his ministry. And then the day came when the Spirit of God came upon that small gathering of people, and Peter preached his first sermon and had thousands of converts that they baptized on the day of Pentecost, and the church age was introduced. And I was taught, I have people who differ with me on this because of millennialism, but if I live long enough, we'll get them straightened out. That's supposed to be funny. But anyhow, what we're saying here is that the church age started at Pentecost and concludes with the second coming of Christ. Then it's over. So now, with this background, we will begin looking here at the text here that Jesus is talking about, and you can read in addition to that some sections of the 17th chapter of the book of Luke that he'd already talked about. But Jesus initially is talking about immediate judgment on Israel, because Israel in his day had done exactly the same thing. They had allowed themselves to be diverted from the will of God, and they were more political than they were religious. They were corrupt. They have allowed the system to become corrupt. One of the reasons that I believe in congregational authority rather than an overall system, if so many of our denominational headquarters have gone really left-wing and don't believe the Bible anymore. When I say left-wing, I'm talking about whether you believe the Bible or don't. In the bulk of the seminaries now, the teachers do not believe the Bible. So Jesus was talking about impending judgment because Israel in his day were guilty of the same thing that had happened, that Samaria had done, same thing that Judea had done, that brought judgment to them. So he's saying it's coming again. And the thing about God's judgment that you need to understand, now God and I differ on this. I have never liked God's timing. I always thought mine was better. Did you ever have that struggle? You know, if somebody wrongs me, he says to me, turn the other cheek, walk the second mile, blah, 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 blah. And then he actually says in plain language, leave room for me to exercise judgment, because vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. But he never repays on time. I want him before the sun goes down to smack him around, stomp on him, and send him away. Now, he promises that he'll exercise judgment, and I really want that, but he never does it on my time. I suspect I've got company there. But God says he's going to exercise judgment, and he promises that. And Peter actually refers to that. He said, you know, God will keep his promise. He's not slack concerning his promise, not slow concerning, as some men count it, but is long-suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish. He wants to give these clods that have mistreated me, he wants to give those clods a chance to repent. I just want him to bop them upside the head. But God is a tad kinder than I am. Just a little. Now, so, because of that, he's saying that Israel is going to suffer horribly in the immediate future. It turns out in 70 A.D., Rome, under a general named Titus, he's leading an outfit called the 10th Legion, comes into Israel, and this is what he does. Just what they always do. He surrounded Jerusalem, conquered it, tore down all the walls, destroyed the temple that Herod had built, carried off all the wealth back to Rome. There's a group called the Sicarii. Any of you who have been with us when we've gone to Israel and gone down to Masada, there's a hill down there that's just kind of like this, that's hard to conquer, and they built walls around it. And so the 10th Legion hears about the Sicarii. The Sicarii were just really wicked guys, and they're called that because they all carried a knife that was crooked, and the term Sicarii means crooked knife. And they would go about Jerusalem, and anybody that paid their taxes to Rome, if they got a chance, they would kill them. And so the people in Jerusalem actually chased them out of Jerusalem down, about 1,500 of them, down to Masada. And when the 10th Legion had conquered Jerusalem, they sent the legion down to Masada, surrounded the place, and ultimately built a ramp all the way up to the top of the wall. And when they were ready to go over the top, most of the people there committed suicide. And so Israel was totally devastated and conquered. Same way it always done it. Tear down the walls, destroy the religious centers, and make them, and he called that executing judgment. Now, so this first part that we're going to read here as we go through addresses what Jesus is referring to when he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 A.D. So here's what it says. Some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned by beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, as for what you see here, the time will come, 70 A.D., when no stone will be left on another, every one of them will be thrown down. Now see, that's exactly what happened in Samaria. That's exactly what happened in Jerusalem a couple of other times. Teacher, they ask, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they're about to take place? What they were saying is, we want to know ahead of time so we can cut out. I don't blame them for that. He replied, watch out that you're not deceived. For many will come in my name claiming I am he, and the time is near. Because they messed up, and the reason he's saying that is, they messed up the destruction of Jerusalem with the second coming of Christ. They got the two confused. And so he deals with that confusion here in this text and tries to straighten it out. Now, concerning the destruction of Jerusalem, he says the time is near. When you hear of wars and revolutions, don't be frightened. These things must happen first. By the end will not come right away. He's talking about the second coming here. And see, he mixes those together because people were assuming that the Messiah would come back, that Jesus would return any day. And he's saying that ain't going to happen until Jerusalem is dealt with and it falls. Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be earthquakes, famines, pestilence in various places, fearful events, and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will he says, but before all this happens, they're going to lay hands on you and persecute you. They will deliver you to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name. Now, Jesus is talking about what's going to be recorded in the book of Acts and in church history. In the book of Acts, in addition to the Apostle Paul, who went through all of these things, there were 17 others who were persecuted that are mentioned in the book of Acts. He said this will result in your being witnesses to them. Now we need to stop there just for a minute because you can miss something that's really kind of neat here. This word witness comes from a Greek word martyreo, where we get our English word martyr. So what he's really saying is the result will be a lot of you will be martyrs just because you have followed in my name. And see, we don't see much of that here. But I could take you to South Sudan in Africa, just north of Uganda, where Patrick and Eddie are from. And I can tell you that there is a civil war going on there. You go just a little northwest of there, where Cyrus Bondo is from, and there has been a civil war going on there for a long time. These wars are all of, and Christian people are being targeted to be killed. Now, this is going on somewhere all of the time because Jesus said what? There will always be wars and rumors of wars. That's the world we live in because it's a fallen world. And you, just because you wear the name of Christ, will not get protection. You'll get assistance, but you won't get protection. You'll become martyrs. And when you die, your witness will be, I have remained faithful even unto death. And so the translators use that word witness, but they're really talking about martyrdom. And he says, don't worry. Then he goes on and says, don't worry But, make up your mind not to worry before how you will defend yourselves. For I will give you words and wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. Because you see, when you die for your faith, that can't be denied. You will be betrayed, and I can tell stories here, but I don't have time, even by parents, brothers, relatives, and friends, and they will put some of you to death. The tradition says that the Apostle Paul, when he became a follower of Jesus, the tradition says that there is a tradition that says he was married and had 2 sons, and they both left him. That they all left him when he became a Christian and went with the mama. There's more to the story, but all men will hate you because of me. Now hang on, folks, because we here now are approaching the time when preaching the Bible, preaching all of the Bible, will be, at least excerpts from it, will be probably by our own government identified as hate speech. For instance, if you were to quote the 14th chapter of the Gospel of John, when Jesus said, the only way to heaven is through me, that very likely will qualify as hate speech. We're not far away from facing some of that others have faced for a long time. But he tells us, he continues to say, but in spite of that, stand firm. Don't give an inch. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, he goes ahead to say, and here he's talking about the fall of Jerusalem, you will know that desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out. Let those in the country not enter the city, for this is the time of punishment in fulfillment of all that has been written. And then he says something that you need to be aware of. He says, how dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. This will be great distress in the land and wrath against his people. There's something here that historically you need to be aware of. My guess is the most influential and oft referred to sermon in the history of America was mentioning this word dreadful. There was an old guy, and he was as boring. This preacher was, he made me look exciting. He was so boring. And he preached this sermon, and he took it from a passage in Hebrews when it says, it's a dreadful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that sermon kicked off one of the great awakenings, and we've had 2 or 3 of them here in our land, and how dreadful. He says, when he finished reading, he read the sermon. Young boys and girls were writhing on the floor in pain and agony of fear of facing God because of the way we were living. Now, because Jesus is saying this is going to be a dreadful time when Israel falls into the hands of the Romans. There'll be great distress. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. See, that same thing is happening, the redistribution of people. Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. Now then, he's talking about how Jerusalem and Israel will be punished because they have failed miserably in living a life that reflects primarily what's expected of people who seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. They have allowed themselves to be diverted to things that really are immaterial, but we happen to think are important. And our culture in America is coming close to that time by saying, what's really important to you? My parents told me the most important thing when I was growing up, and this was a religious home, never missed church, we went 3 times a week. But the most important thing was they have lived through the Great Depression, and the greatest thing they could see was that our lives would be better than their lives had been. And I suspect that if we poll the committee, even the folks who are sitting here, a great number of them will say the most important thing, we want nice cars, we want beautiful homes, we want a living income, we want to live better, we want to start our home living at least as well as our parents have taken 40 years to get. It's all wrapped up in this world and personal comfort. And the Bible says that those who really are sold out to God ain't going to be very comfortable very often, because we will be targeted by Satan and his forces. Now, Jesus is going to move from the destruction of Jerusalem and its burning and now he's going to move shortly to the second coming of Christ. He goes on to say there will be signs of the sun and the moon and the stars on earth, and nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and the tossing of the sea. Men will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming to the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. What he's saying here now in 10th century language is when Jesus comes again, it's going to be cosmic. It's not going to be local. It was local in Samaria, it was local in Jerusalem, and local in Jerusalem the second time. But this is going to be because the church is universal, and since the church is universal, judgment will be universal at the coming of Christ. It's going to be cosmic. And he is saying the whole world is going to shake and tremble. All of creation which is turned against God will be adversely affected and shaken at the very promise of God coming again, because we know judgment is in this coming shortly. But he raises an interesting question. For those of us who claim to love Jesus and have been adopted into God's family, what should our attitude be when we see the coming of Christ? Will your knees knock? Will you shake and shudder like the whole of creation that rebelled against, that was adversely affected when sin came into the world by the original sin? Now he says, if you really love Jesus, you're going to be excited about seeing Him. And you're not going to be fearful, you're going to be excited. Here's what he says. When these things begin to take place, stand up, lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing nigh. You see the difference? He's saying, because God's perfect love casts out fear. Well, I'm thinking that a lot of us need to examine ourselves pretty carefully to see what our attitude would be if we saw Jesus coming on the clouds of heaven. Then he tells a little story here. But, what he's saying is, in other places, I'll just refer quickly to other places. He said, as it was, and this is in the 17th chapter of the book of Luke, and we don't have time to read it, but he said, as it was in the days of Noah. Here's what it's going to be like before Jesus comes again. What was it like in the days of Noah? They were marrying, giving in marriage, building bigger houses, so on. They could let this old guy build a boat, and they said, if you've never been to the Ark thing down in Kentucky, you need to go see it. They all saw that big old monster that he was building, and they just yawned and walked away and said, that guy's nuts. And they stayed that way until he went into the ark and God shut the door and it started to rain. But it was too late. Then he references in that same passage there in Luke, he references Lot. He said, look what happened to Lot. Nobody paid any attention to poor old Lot going outside the city, but as soon as he was gone, the city was burned up, trampled underfoot. Haven't been able to find it yet. So Jesus is teaching this about the second coming. Now let me give you a few other things before I quit, because I'm not going to get through that. I just want you to know, I'm going to start reading it, skip a section and go to verse 34. Be careful, or your hearts will be weighed down with dissipation, drunkenness, and anxieties of life. Be careful that happens to you. Now, here's what I'm telling you. I know a lot of Christians who are suffering from anxiety attacks. And so they do what they take, anti-anxiety pills, whatever they are. I had a friend, doctor, he's dead now. We were eating supper with him, Bob Martin and Joyce and Harlan Williams and Alice Kay and I were eating supper together one night, and Dr. Martin said, you know what, this was during while the Soviet Union was still kicking. He said, you know, they don't have to come over here and bomb us with atomic bombs. All they got to do is to blow up the fuel factories and we'll kill each other. Because we're so wrapped up into that foolishness. Folks, we become anxious about the things of this world instead of excited about the coming King. And we need to evaluate where we stand with that. For it will come upon you, upon all those who live on the face of the whole earth. I told you, it's going to be cosmic. So always be watching and praying, so that you may be able to escape all that will happen, and you'll be able to stand before the Son of Man. Now look, folks. When Jesus comes, if you really know Him and been talking to Him all the time and have been studying His will and His Word, if you've been doing that, you'll be glad to see Him. In spite of all the stuff that's going to happen. Because Peter says, and you need to know that this is what he says, what happened to Samaria? It was destroyed and burned. What happened to Jerusalem time and again? It was destroyed and burned. What's going to happen to this world? Do you know when Jesus comes again? Well, he went to a lot of trouble to tell us. Because here's what he says. He says that the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything in it will be laid bare. And it goes on to say, now, since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought we to be? He says we ought to be holy. We ought to live holy and godly lives as we look forward to the day of God and speed up its coming. I don't think many of us qualify. Here's my observation. I have read carefully, because some of you are fiddling around with the book of Revelation, and I've read it carefully, and I'll just make sure some things are in my head. But when you go to the church at Laodicea in the opening 3rd chapter of the book of Revelation, it talks about a church that has everything. Their buildings are paid for, their air conditioning works, parking lots paved, all that good stuff. But he said, here's the problem. You just are laid back and relaxed with what you have. comfortable where you are. And he says, watch out. Because he said, I wish that you were either hot or cold, because lukewarmness makes me sick. I'll vomit that. He makes me want to puke. What's God looking for and expecting from us? He's expecting you and me to be verbal and live a life consistent with our verbiage that exalts Jesus Christ in everything we say and do, in our business relationships, in our marital relationships, in our church relationships, in everything we do. Let's be the light of the world, and let's show this terrible, lost and dying world who God is by the way we live on a daily basis, by the way we treat each other. If we do that, you'll become the light of the world. And you won't be anxious when Jesus comes. You'll just be excited because now we see through a glass darkly, then we're going to see him kisser to kisser. That's a good day coming. And we can speed up its coming by the way that we live. I'm done. I hope you're ready to meet him. I pray that God will bless you. Those who are watching on the tube or whatever the thing is that you watch on, hurry up and get back here. I'd like to see you face to face. We're very comfortable here. We're 6 foot apart. And we're trying to keep everybody safe. But Acts 2:42 said, and they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine. Fellowship, we need to be together. You don't have to kiss me, just wink at me. Because we'd be glad to see you, and you will be safe here. God bless you. Have a good week. You're free to go.
Christ Community meets on Saturday at 5 p.m. and Sunday at 10:30 a.m. For more information, visit www.christcommunity.net or check out our Facebook page.